This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Susan.
And I'm Heather.
And we're in the book of 2 Samuel. Welcome to the club.
Last time on Bible Book Club in 2 Samuel chapter 13, we learned that David and his sons who were following in his ways, like father, like son, Amnon is distracted by women, and in particular, women he cannot and should not desire to have. In this case, it's his half-sister Tamar that he wants. Amnon uses David to get what he wants. He rapes Tamar and throws her out in humiliation. Well, David is furious, but he still does nothing. While Absalom, Tamar's brother, plots revenge, 2 years later, Absalom murders Amnon. Again, like father, like son. Amnon's sin was sexual, as David's with Bathsheba. Absalom's sin was murder, as David's with Uriah. Nathan had warned David about the consequences of his sin. The sword would not depart from his household, and David is living that reality.
And unfortunately for David, the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy is not over, but just begun. Scene 1, Joab interferes. If it appears to us that David is incapable of managing relationships with his children, it must have been painfully apparent to Joab, who's living with this reality. Joab, you will recall, is David's nephew and the commander-in-chief of his army. He's an intriguing Bible character because while extremely loyal to David, he was also very ruthless. Now remember in 2 Samuel chapter 3, how he went behind David's back and killed Abner. That was episode 3. So take a look at that if you don't remember. Now when this scene opens, David seems kind of melancholy, unable to make decisions. Joab, being a relative of David's and the leader of the army, decides to interfere and force what he thinks is right. Chapter 14.
Joab, son of Uriah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak those words to him." And Joab put the words in her mouth.
So Joab interferes, presumably out of concern for the king and the continuity of the crown. David is unable to bridge the divide between himself and Absalom, and Joab feels his pain. And it bothers him because David wants Absalom back, but he worries what people will think. Absalom committed murder, and the law dictates that he should die for it. David, under the law, was the avenger of blood for Amnon. Now, this was a term used for the person responsible for justice for the victim. The term first appeared in Numbers 35, Season 4, Episode 18. Listen to what Moses said.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger, so that anyone accused of murder may not die before they stand trial before the assembly." And then continuing on later in verse 19, "The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. When the avenger comes upon the murderer, the avenger shall put the murderer to death." And then continuing a little later in verse 29, it mentions this. "This is to have the force of law for you throughout the generations to come wherever you live."
So when we learned about this, remember we talked about that there are no police, there's no army back then. So there's much more to these laws, but generally the family members of the victim were the blood avengers. That meant David and or his other sons were the ones to avenge Amnon's death. David does not want to sentence his son Absalom to die. Yet David knows that under the law, the people of Israel may expect him to do it if Absalom comes back. Joab thinks otherwise. He thinks David can do whatever he wants, including overriding God's laws. So Joab comes up with this strategy to change David's mind about the dilemma with Absalom. He uses Nathan's trick to convict David of his sin with Bathsheba. he comes up with his story about someone else in a similar situation.
Continuing in verse 4, when the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor. And she said, "Help me, your majesty." The king asked her, "What is troubling you?" And she said, "I am a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." The king said to the woman, "Go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf." But the woman from Tekoa said to him, "Let my lord the king pardon me and my family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." The king replied, "If anyone says anything to you, bring them to me, and they will not bother you again." She said, "Then let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed. As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground."
So she tells this story about having 2 sons and one son kills the other son. And now if the relatives avenge the death of the one son and kill the other son, then she has no one to carry on her husband's name. And remember, back then you inherited the land through your father. And so if you didn't have a son, the land got divided up amongst cousins. She doesn't want that. Well, David's compassionate heart is his undoing. He impulsively makes a judgment that overturns Moses' law about the avenger of blood. As king, he declares that the woman's son who murdered her other son will not die for his crime.
Verse 12, then the woman said, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak," he replied. And the woman said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son? Like the water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will grant his servant's request. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who is trying to cut off both me and my son from God's inheritance. And now your servant says, may the word of the Lord, the king, secure my inheritance. For my lord, the king, is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. May the Lord, your God, be with you.
The woman points out the obvious, that her son's situation exactly parallels Absalom's. Therefore, David is forced to apply what he decreed was right for her son on his own son, Absalom. David knows he has been played, and he knows who did it.
Verse 18, then the king said to the woman, don't keep from me the answer to what I am going to ask you. Let my lord the king speak, the woman said. And the king asked, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this? And the woman answered, as surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God, and he knows everything that happens in the land.
David immediately suspects Joab of putting the woman up to the story, a sure sign that Joab must have been unsuccessfully harassing David about Absalom. But unlike the first story told by Nathan the prophet, this story was Joab's doing, not God's. This was a trick of Joab to get what he wanted, and David gave it to him. David didn't pray about it or ask Nathan about it. He just went with it, probably because in his heart, he wanted it too. Note to us, sometimes what we want is bad for us and for our families, and sometimes our heart can mislead us. It may look right, it may feel right, but it's still wrong if it doesn't align with God's word. Well, the wise woman freely admits that Joab was behind the trick, but then she diplomatically smooths the way with compliments. For the second time, the woman tells David he has the wisdom like an angel of God. The first time, she even went so far as to say he discerned good from evil, which is ironic because he was just tricked by her into acting unwisely, and his actions will trigger more evil. David falls for the flattery.
Verse 21, the king said to Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay him honor, and he blessed the king. Joab said, "Today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king has granted his servant's request." Then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king.
Joab wins the day and gets what he wants, although he won't want it for long. Absalom returns, but he is not allowed to see his father, and his crime of murder goes unpunished. David's failure to discipline his children once again leads to more trouble. Scene 2, Absalom fans the flames of rebellion.
Verse 25, in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut the hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. 3 sons and a daughter were born to Absalom. His daughter's name was Tamar, and she became a beautiful woman.
Absalom was everything Israel wanted in a king. Like Saul, he had the look and apparently the hair. When cut, it weighed about, believe it or not, 6 pounds. I can't imagine. I don't know. In those days, hair was considered a great ornament, and the longer it was, the more it was admired. It is no wonder that Absalom, who thrived on popularity, let it grow to create a great show. Absalom had 3 sons, but special mention by name is given to his daughter, which he named after his sister Tamar, which is sweet when you consider how evil he is.
Continuing in verse 28, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but he refused to come. Then he said to his servants, "Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house, and he said to him, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" Absalom said to Joab, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? Would it be better for me if I were still there? Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death.'" So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom.
2 years is the tipping point for Absalom. He waited 2 years to kill Amnon, and here he waited 2 years to be recognized by his father as the heir to the throne. While waiting, he is treated as an outcast, and he does not like being ignored, banned from the palace. It makes him hot with fury because Absalom craves attention. So after waiting 2 years to see his father, he is over the waiting. When Joab won't see him either, he fires up Joab's field to get his attention. It worked. The man is violent. Joab goes to the king, and the king relents and summons Absalom. Absalom bows, David kisses him, and that's it. No discussion about Tamar, Amnon, rape, murder, no repentance, no forgiveness. The whole thing is just swept under the rug. David does nothing, and God is silent.
This is just a little bit of a mess where it's like a bunch of people who think that they're above the law.
Yeah, or they don't want to face the consequences. David.
Feeling like they're above the law.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Hiding from the law. Scene 3, Absalom rebels. Chapter 15 begins with, "in the course of time," which is that transition statement our author has used to tie this story to a bigger one about David. The phrase reminds us that the larger story about David is the story of his before and after Bathsheba. Before he fell, he experienced a life of blessings. After he fell, he experienced a life of consequences, just like the original fall of Adam and Eve. The author is reminding us that we are in David's after, and what is about to happen is yet another result of his fall, and yet another consequence.
Chapter 15. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel.
Absalom is right where he wants to be. He's manipulated Joab and David. With his triumph over them, he thinks he can do anything. And he wants it all: the crown, the country, the dynasty. And he wants it now. So he begins his campaign for king by stealing the hearts of the people.
He's like a petulant child.
Oh, he's bad. His campaign is very clever. First, Absalom acquired the look. He made an impressive entrance wherever he went, with chariots and horses to run ahead of him. And remember, Moses told kings not to acquire chariots and horses, so he does the opposite of everything Moses says. Then he interceded with citizens who had complaints, assuring them that he could do better as a judge than King David. Last, he shook hands and kissed babies, pretending to be a man of the people. Absalom would have fared very well today as a politician. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, Israel has been here before. They started with a king who had the look but not the heart. A king who rejected God's anointed choice, David. Absalom is just like Saul. His focus is on finding favor with the people and not with God. He has forgotten God, forgotten that David is God's anointed. And in rebelling against David, he rebels against God, just like Saul. After 4 years of this campaign on Israel, Absalom finally makes his move.
Verse 7. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron." 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Galileanite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing.
Absalom gets permission from his father David by lying. And once again, David looked so gullible I could shake him. Because remember, Amnon asked David to send Tamar, and she was raped. Absalom asked David to send Amnon, and he was killed. David should be highly suspicious of anything his kids ask for. But David just says, "Go in peace," which is so ironic because Absalom is going to start a war, not peace. And where was Joab is what I'm thinking, because he's not so gullible. how did he miss this plot? Especially if Absalom is like meeting people at the gate and trying to tell him he's better than David. How did Joab miss it all? I don't know.
It's almost like they're all blinded to it because Joab thought this was a good idea to let him live. And now he's kind of complicit in this thing. And David, while he's this great man after God's own heart, he's not a great father. And so sometimes you can just be blinded to the faults of your kids,
that's part of the consequence, that they were blinded because this had to play out. Well, Absalom heads to Hebron. Now remember Hebron. We began the book of 2 Samuel in Hebron. Hebron was the city where David began to build his kingdom after Saul's death. It was such a time of blessing and celebration. All good feels there. And hint from the author, that chapter began with our transition statement, listen, in the course of time.
Going back to 2 Samuel chapter 2, in the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah, he asked. The Lord said, go up. And David asked, where shall I go? To Hebron, the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, where they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah.
So this is a brilliant move by Absalom. Absalom sets the stage for a reenactment of an old scene from Israel's history, the scene of his father being made king. The scene was David's anointing in Hebron, surrounded by the men of Judah. Absalom is making his transition to king reflect David's transition, which was a brilliant play for all these people present who were probably present at David's. The scene is so well thought out that it very accurately mirrored the first. David asked God where he should go. Absalom asked David if he could go. David took his men. Absalom took 200 invited guests who didn't know where they were going, including Ahithophel, one of David's counselors. David was anointed by the men of Judah at Hebron. Absalom sacrificed in front of the men of Judah at Hebron. The whole scene was probably very nostalgic, comforting even to those who were present thinking, oh, look, this is David's son. This is tradition. This is the future of Israel. This is why David had given permission. Therefore, this is David's wish for us to see this.
And I like the contrast there of where David inquired of the Lord, Absalom is inquiring, in this case, David. But it's a reminder to us about the difference between when we follow what God's asking us to do, God, what do you want me to do? Versus when we try to make it happen on our own.
Yes. And David prayed. He asked God. David did not pray when he gave his permission to his son.
And obviously Absalom is not anywhere close to doing something like that.
Absalom scored big strategy points and his conspiracy took off. David did too. Scene 4, David runs from Absalom. David is now running from his own son, just as he ran from Saul. This must have been very triggering for David. He has been down this road of hurt before. He is on the run for his life from someone he has loved and only ever shown kindness to. It is Saul over again, but this is worse. This is his own flesh and blood, his son. Why would someone he loves want to kill him?
Now back to our story in 2 Samuel chapter 15, continuing in verse 13. A messenger came and told David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately or he will move quickly and overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword. The king's officials answered him, your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses.
All right, this is so sad to me. David leaves the city on a very painful journey. On the way out of Jerusalem, David meets a series of people who are forced to take sides between David and Absalom. Scene 5. Ittai is loyal to David.
The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Paleothites, and all 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why should you come with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness." But Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." David said to Ittai, "Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him.
Note, I don't know if you caught this, but it's so interesting that David calls Absalom King Absalom in verse 19. And you have to wonder, is he convinced Absalom will be king? Is he afraid that if he's not, he's going to die? Because, a king war, usually only one king survives. Or is this road to hiding so reminiscent of his wilderness run from King Saul that he is now picturing Absalom as that king? I don't know.
See, and I was kind of thinking that he might have felt that this guy, since he's new and a foreigner, maybe he's really loyal to Absalom. And so he's kind of trying to say, go to the other king. He doesn't really want like a spy in his camp or something like that.
Could be. We don't know. Well, it is interesting, though, that the first people to choose loyalty to David are all foreigners. The Kerethites and the Pelethites were probably royal bodyguards. And it's so interesting to me because over a year ago, I went to the Vatican and did a tour, and I did not know that it's all Swiss guards. Like the guards of the Vatican who guard the Pope are Swiss for that reason. They're not Italian. So you choose somebody who's a paid loyal person from another.
That way they have no allegiance.
Exactly.
And nobody can get to them.
Exactly. So most likely, they were Philistine soldiers who became followers when David was in exile at Ziklag. You can go back and see 1 Samuel 27 through 30 is when he was stationed at Ziklag. Well, the Gittites are new followers, and their leader, Ittai, chooses David despite the fact that his cause does not look good at this time. The contrast the author is making between the Israelites who desert David and the foreigners who remain faithful to David is that the foreigners see God more than even the Israelites
They're more
do.
objective.
They are, I guess. Scene 6. Zadok and the priests are loyal to David.
Verse 23. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. They set down the Ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back to the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and its dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, and also Abiathar's son Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there.
So in all our stories of David, he has always been very concerned about the ark's care. And remember, he even wanted to build a temple to house the ark because that's the seat of God.
And God said, "No, you're not going to build that house. You're going to build the house."
Yes, but he really cares. So Zadok and the Levites naturally assume that they and the ark should go with David if the city is under attack because David will protect them and the ark belongs with David. David thinks not. He puts the situation in God's hands. Here we see his faith shine again. He is utterly submissive to God's desire for the outcome of this battle for the crown. Jerusalem was God's city, and the ark was God's dwelling place. Therefore, it belonged in Jerusalem. David believes that if God wants him to be king, he will return to the ark in Jerusalem. David also knows that taking the ark with him doesn't mean he will win the war. The Israelites tried that in 1 Samuel 4, and instead the Israelites lost and the ark was captured by the Philistines. So kudos to David for learning that lesson. Scene 7. Hushai is loyal to David.
Verse 30. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators of Absalom. So David prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, If you go with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant. Then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear. So Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city.
David, not by chance, is walking up the Mount of Olives when he gets some discouraging news. One of his advisors, Ahithophel, betrayed him and joined Team Absalom. While walking, David prays in the Mount of Olives that God would turn Ahithophel's counsel to foolishness. He arrives at the summit of the Mount of Olives, and there is the answer to his prayer. Hushai, a loyal advisor. David asks him to be a spy in the palace. David needs Hushai to send him intelligence through the priest Zadok and his sons. If Hushai could do that, it would be an answer to his prayer. They could turn Ahithophel's counsel to foolishness. Hushai agrees. David has not given up. He begins to see a way to fight back with a combination of faith and strategy. The scene of weeping Israelites and a king climbing up the Mount of Olives prefigures the passion of another anointed king centuries later. Like this story, Jesus' journey through the Mount of Olives was a painful one. Jesus had to suffer consequences that weren't even his, and the betrayal of many people, just like David. But the pain, suffering, and sacrifice were a gift for eternity.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.